The world had been plunged into an abyss, a maelstrom of chaos and destruction that clawed at the very fabric of existence. Distant explosions, like the percussive beat of a monstrous heart, echoed through the shattered cityscape, each reverberation a stark reminder of the unseen forces tearing everything apart. What was once a vibrant tapestry of life, teeming with the laughter of children and the hum of commerce, now lay in ruins, a skeletal monument to a bygone era. Buildings, once proud sentinels against the sky, crumbled under the relentless assault, their steel bones twisting into grotesque caricatures of their former selves. Dust and debris, thick and suffocating, hung heavy in the air, a grimy shroud that veiled the sun and choked the breath from anyone daring to venture outside. It was a physical manifestation of the widespread despair that gripped the hearts of the few survivors, a constant, gritty reminder of the world's descent into madness. Amidst this apocalyptic tableau, a lone figure navigated the collapsing streets. His name, for now, remained unspoken, his identity universal in its suffering. His face, etched with a profound and primal fear, was a canvas of human vulnerability. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a potential threat in this new, brutal reality. His hand, calloused and trembling, clutched a small, worn wooden cross. It was more than just a religious artifact. It was a tangible link to a faith now tested beyond comprehension, a fragile anchor in a sea of despair. The smooth, cool wood offered a strange comfort against the rough fabric of his tattered clothes, a silent promise of something enduring amidst the ephemeral destruction. The ground beneath him suddenly convulsed, a violent tremor that sent a shiver of terror through his very bones. Nearby, a skyscraper, its upper floors already gnarled and broken, groaned under the immense strain. With a thunderous roar that swallowed all other sounds, it began its agonizing descent, peeling away in layers of concrete and glass. A monstrous cloud of dust billowed outwards, engulfing everything in its path, momentarily blinding the man as he stumbled, desperately trying to shield himself. He coughed, the acrid taste of pulverized masonry filling his mouth, his eyes watering from the stinging dust. As the immediate chaos subsided, a deep, resonant voice, seemingly from nowhere and everywhere, pierced the oppressive silence. It was a voice that seemed to vibrate, not just in his ears, but in the very core of his being, a question that cut through the physical desolation and struck at the heart of his soul. When everything fell apart, what would you choose? The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, a challenge whispered into the void. It was an invitation to introspection, a demand for an answer that transcended mere survival. The man, still reeling from the near miss, slowly straightened, his gaze sweeping across the desolate expanse. His chest heaved, a ragged breath escaping his lips. The question lingered, a profound echo in the stillness that followed the collapse, forcing him to confront the abyss within as much as the one without. This world, once so familiar, had become a crucible, forging new realities, demanding choices that no one should ever have to make. And in that moment, standing amidst the ruins with the dust settling like a final judgment, the weight of that question settled upon him, heavy and unyielding. The storm had fully unraveled, and he was caught squarely in its terrifying eye, forced to confront not just the end of his world, but the very essence of his being. The profound question, resonating through the dust-choked air, seemed to peel back layers of the present devastation, revealing glimpses of a life that felt impossibly distant, a world that once breathed with vibrant normalcy. It was a life before the relentless cacophony of war, before the sky wept fire and the earth groaned under the weight of destruction. Then, the days unfolded with a quiet rhythm, punctuated by the gentle hum of existence, not the piercing shriek of falling debris. The man, nameless in the grand scheme of this universal tragedy, had been a simple soul, his hands accustomed to honest labor, his heart tethered to the familiar comforts of home and family. Now, his gaze swept over the skeletal remains of what had once been his sanctuary. The walls, charred and crumbling, stood as testament to a brutal invasion, not a steadfast shelter. This was where laughter had once echoed, where the scent of baking bread had mingled with the earthy aroma of his small garden. It was a place where dreams were nurtured, where the mundane became sacred through the simple act of living. Now, Only the wind whispered through the vacant window frames, carrying with it the mournful dirge of what was lost. His eyes, heavy with unshed tears, traced the outline of a small faded mark on the floor, a scuff from a beloved toy. A child's wooden horse, half buried beneath a pile of rubble and ash, poked out its chipped head, a silent, poignant monument to innocence lost. He reached down, his fingers brushing against the rough, splintered wood, a phantom touch of small, trusting hands. Nearby, a photograph, miraculously preserved from the inferno, lay face down. With a hesitant breath, he turned it over. The image, though faded and creased, depicted a smiling woman, her eyes warm and full of life, holding a beaming child aloft. A family, whole and vibrant, frozen in a moment of pure joy, now existing only in the fragile confines of memory and this tattered relic. A quiet sigh escaped his lips, a mournful sound swallowed by the vast silence of the ruins. The man's stoic demeanor, a shield he had painstakingly constructed against the relentless assaults of his new reality, barely concealed the profound grief that gnawed at his very core. The weight of immense loss pressed down on him, a crushing burden that threatened to buckle his spirit. Each shattered brick, each splintered beam, was a shard of his former life, a poignant reminder of the chasm that now separated him from everything he had ever held dear. The world around him was a barren landscape of destruction, an endless panorama of desolation that mirrored the emptiness within. Buildings stood like hollowed-out giants, their innards exposed to the unforgiving sky. Roads, once bustling arteries of life, were now fractured veins, choked with debris and the husks of abandoned vehicles. The air itself seemed to carry the scent of decay and despair, a constant, oppressive presence. This pervasive emptiness reinforced his profound isolation, making him feel like the last living soul in a world that had died around him. He was a lone sentinel in a graveyard of memories, the sole witness to a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The vastness of his suffering was reflected in the silent, sprawling wreckage, a testament to the unquantifiable toll of conflict. Every fiber of his being resonated with a hollow ache, a profound sense of absence that no amount of time or distance could ever truly diminish. The silence, broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a lone bird, amplified the internal clamor of his grief, a constant low thrum beneath the surface of his composure. The protagonist's internal battle against despair had now truly begun, a silent, relentless war waged within the confines of his own mind. He found himself grappling with questions that clawed at the very foundations of his being, doubts that twisted and turned like serpents in the desolate landscape of his soul. Where was God amidst such widespread devastation? How could a benevolent creator allow such unquantifiable suffering, such absolute annihilation of beauty and life? The silence from above was not merely an absence of sound, it was a deafening void, a chasm that threatened to swallow his flickering faith whole. Moments of profound doubt assailed him like physical blows. He would walk through the ruins, his worn boots crunching on shattered glass and pulverized stone, and each step felt like a further descent into spiritual uncertainty. His faith, once a sturdy oak, now wavered like a candle flame in a hurricane, threatening to extinguish completely with every gust of sorrow and confusion. He recalled countless prayers whispered in hushed tones over the years, pleas for protection, for guidance, for peace. Now, in this desolate reality, they seemed to mock him, hollow echoes in a world devoid of divine intervention. The feeling of abandonment was a bitter taste in his mouth, a constant companion to his hunger and thirst. He had called out, earnestly, repeatedly, but no answer had come, no sign, no solace. The struggle was visceral, a constant push and pull between the primal guttural urge for sheer survival and the lingering, almost forgotten call to spiritual surrender. His instincts screamed for him to scavenge, to flee, to fight, to simply exist. Yet a deeper, more profound yearning tugged at him, a desire to understand, to reconcile this horrific reality with the teachings he had once held so dear. Anger simmered beneath the surface of his composure, a hot, acrid rage directed at the injustice, at the senselessness of it all. This anger mingled with a profound confusion, creating a complex emotional landscape that shifted and churned within him. Sorrow, a constant, heavy blanket, draped itself over everything, dulling his senses and clouding his thoughts. He was a tempest of conflicting emotions, a man adrift in an ocean of pain without a compass or a star to guide him. He was often found alone, a solitary figure silhouetted against the desolate horizon, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, his thoughts a tumultuous storm. The wind would whip around him, carrying dust and the scent of decay, mirroring the internal chaos that raged within. He would stand there for hours, unmoving, a statue carved from despair, contemplating the vast, indifferent expanse of the ruined world. The sun would rise and set, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, but he remained unchanged, trapped in the relentless cycle of his own internal torment. The silence from above, once merely deafening, now felt like an active rejection, a pronouncement of his utter insignificance. It pushed him to the very brink of spiritual collapse, threatening to shatter the last vestiges of his belief into a million irreparable pieces. Each passing moment was a test, each unanswered question a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of his faith. He was suspended in a horrifying limbo, caught between the world he had known and the terrifying void that now beckoned. His spirit, once vibrant, was slowly, agonizingly, being ground down, leaving behind only the stark, unyielding landscape of raw human endurance. The very ground beneath his feet seemed to conspire against him, a treacherous stage for the final act of his undoing. A sudden, jarring shift in the rubble, a loose stone dislodged by his weary foot, sent him tumbling down a short, treacherous incline. He landed hard, a sharp, excruciating pain lancing through his left leg. A guttural cry escaped his lips, quickly swallowed by the omnipresent silence of destruction. He tried to push himself up, but a searing agony radiated from his ankle, a clear, undeniable signal of a severe injury. A visible wound, raw and bleeding, now joined the invisible scars etched upon his soul, a fresh testament to his increasing vulnerability. He was no longer merely a survivor, he was now wounded prey, his already precarious existence tipped precariously closer to its inevitable end. As he lay there gasping for breath, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of distant footsteps reached his ears. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. He strained to listen, his senses heightened by adrenaline and fear, trying to discern the source, the direction, the intention. He knew with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones that these were not the footsteps of fellow survivors seeking solace. These were the heavy, deliberate treads of those who sought to exploit, to dominate, to destroy. An ambush, he realized with a sickening lurch, was not just a possibility, it was an impending reality. His last refuge, a precarious lean-to fashioned from corrugated metal and shattered planks, was now directly in their path, an exposed target. He tried to drag himself towards it, whimpering with each agonizing movement, but his injured leg refused to cooperate. He watched helpless as two hulking figures emerged from the swirling dust, their faces obscured by makeshift masks, their intentions clear in the glint of the crude weapons they carried. They moved with a predatory efficiency, their eyes scanning the ruins, their gazes like cold steel. His breath hitched in his throat. Everything he had clung to, however small, however insignificant, was about to be stripped away. The meager provisions he had painstakingly gathered, the tattered blanket that offered a sliver of warmth against the biting chill, the last vestiges of his dignity, all were now forfeit. He was utterly alone, isolated in a world that seemed actively hostile, each crumbling wall and shadowed corner a silent witness to his impending fate. The bleakness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed down upon him, stealing the air from his lungs. There was no escape, no hidden path, no miraculous intervention. This was the point of no return, the bottom of the abyss. A profound feeling of hopelessness washed over him, not a gentle wave, but a crushing tsunami that threatened to drown him completely. He felt his endurance finally give way, the last threads of his resilience snapping under the unbearable weight of his circumstances. His mind, once a battleground of conflicting emotions, now settled into a terrifying stillness, a quiet resignation. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to hope for, nothing left to lose. The silence of the approaching figures was punctuated only by the ragged sound of his own breathing, each gasp a testament to a life teetering on the precipice of oblivion. The world had dealt its final, decisive blow, and he, broken and defeated, could only await its inevitable conclusion. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in surrender to the encroaching darkness, the chill of despair seeping into his very bones. The world spun around him, a kaleidoscope of grey dust and shattered memories. He felt the rough texture of debris against his cheek as he collapsed, not with a sudden impact, but a slow, agonizing descent into the rubble. It was not the collapse of a man defeated in battle, but of one utterly surrendered, his physical form mirroring the complete capitulation of his spirit. The last vestiges of his strength had evaporated, leaving him a vessel emptied of all but raw, unadulterated pain. His body, bruised and broken, finally gave way, finding an uneasy rest amidst the jagged fragments of a forgotten life. He lay there, motionless, the approaching footsteps of his tormentors fading into a dull throb in his ears, overshadowed by the deafening silence within himself. The air, thick with the stench of decay and despair, seemed to press down on him, stealing the last reserves of oxygen from his burning lungs. His eyes, though closed, still registered the oppressive darkness, a darkness that was both external and internal. There was no more fight left, no more anger, no more tears. Only an overwhelming, profound emptiness remained, a void where hope once flickered. Then, from somewhere deep within that void, a sound emerged. It was not a cry of anguish, nor a scream of defiance. It was a whisper almost inaudible, a breath of air escaping lips that had forgotten how to smile. "My God," he breathed. The words barely formed, escaping like fragile smoke into the desolate air. There was no demand in his voice, no plea for rescue, no questioning of divine justice. It was a simple, raw acknowledgement of a presence he had long struggled to find amidst the chaos. "My God, I have nothing left," he continued, the whisper gaining a fraction of strength, fueled by an inexplicable source. "I am broken. I am empty. I surrender. Not to them," he clarified, his voice cracking with emotion, "but to you." It was a prayer of ultimate surrender, an admission of his utter powerlessness in the face of such overwhelming destruction. He acknowledged his own insignificance, his inability to control the monstrous forces that had consumed his world. He was a speck of dust, lost in a storm of cosmic proportions. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic pleas for intervention. This was not a negotiation, nor an attempt to bargain with the divine. It was a deeply intimate moment, a soul laid bare before its creator, devoid of pretense or expectation. He simply offered his brokenness, his despair, his very self, without reservation. The worn wooden cross, still clutched tightly in his hand, felt less like a talisman and more like an extension of his own battered spirit, a physical anchor to the faith he was now, in this final moment, choosing to embrace. The act of prayer, in that desolate moment, was his last, desperate act of faith. It was a final reach, not for salvation in the immediate sense, but for connection, for meaning, for anything beyond the crushing weight of his reality. He wasn't asking for the world to stop crumbling, or for his attackers to vanish. He was simply offering himself, a silent testament to a belief that somehow, somewhere, there was still a purpose, even in utter devastation. A strange calm began to settle over him, not the calm of peace, but the quiet defiance found in choosing to believe when there was no logical reason to do so. In the void of his despair, a choice had been made. He had chosen to pray, not out of strength, but out of absolute weakness, a decision born from the deepest well of his being. It was a silent rebellion against the overwhelming despair, a fragile flicker of light in the encroaching darkness. He had finally completely let go. The profound quiet that followed his surrender was not the silence of abandonment, but something else entirely. It was a stillness that seemed to absorb the distant echoes of conflict, a momentary reprieve from the relentless cacophony of war. A subtle shift in the air, barely perceptible, brushed against his face, carrying with it a scent that was not dust or decay, but something faintly reminiscent of damp earth and distant rain. It was a fleeting sensation, Yet it resonated deeply within him, a gentle caress in a world that had known only brutality. Then, a flicker. Not a bright, overwhelming light, but a shadow, dancing at the edge of his periphery. His eyes, still heavy with the weight of unseen tears, slowly opened. Across the rubble-strewn landscape, amidst the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling market, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her clothes tattered, her face smudged with grime, yet there was an undeniable resilience in her stride. She moved with a quiet determination, her gaze sweeping the devastation, not in despair, but in a focused search. Their eyes met across the expanse of ruin. There was no need for words, no shouted greetings that would betray their presence. In her gaze he saw not pity, but a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the suffering they both endured. She held up a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture of silent instruction, pointing subtly towards a partially collapsed alleyway, a fissure in the landscape that he had not noticed before. It was an opening, narrow and shadowed, offering a potential path away from the immediate danger. He watched her for a moment longer, her figure dissolving into the labyrinthine shadows of the destroyed buildings, a phantom of hope in the desolate tableau. The subtle gesture, the fleeting connection, struck him with an unexpected force. It was not a grand miracle, no celestial choir, no burning bush. It was simply another human being, a fellow survivor, offering a silent lifeline in a moment of utter desolation. It was a quiet orchestration of circumstances, a fragment of guidance appearing precisely when his own will had been entirely spent. His body, stiff and aching, protested as he slowly pushed himself upright. The act of standing, which moments before had felt impossible, now seemed imbued with a new, albeit fragile, purpose. He moved towards the alleyway, his steps tentative at first, then gaining a flicker of resolve. The air within the narrow passage was cooler, shielded from the harsh wind that swept across the open ruins. He pressed himself against the crumbling brick, listening. The distant explosions, though still present, seemed muted, less immediate. As he navigated the tight space, another subtle detail emerged. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the light ahead. It was not the glaring, accusatory light of the open sky, but a softer, diffused glow, hinting at a hidden passage or a turn in the alley that might lead to a less exposed area. He moved towards it, his senses heightened, his mind now attuned to these quiet orchestrations, these small, almost invisible nudges. The world had not magically healed, the war had not ceased, but something within him had shifted. The profound emptiness had not vanished, but it was now laced with a thread of something new, something that felt like a quiet resilience. The subtle signs, the woman's silent gesture, the shift in the wind, the softened light, they were not coincidences. They were whispers in the ruins, subtle interventions that, in their unassuming nature, felt more profound than any overt miracle could have been. He continued his arduous journey, moving deeper into the shadows, guided by these almost imperceptible cues. The crushing weight of despair had not lifted entirely, but it had yielded to a fragile glimmer of hope. It was a hope born not of blind optimism, but of a quiet, profound conviction that even in the utter devastation, an unseen hand was at work, gently guiding, subtly protecting. He was still in the midst of chaos, but he was no longer utterly alone. The act of surrender had opened a door to a different kind of perception, where the divine was not in the thunder, but in the whisper, not in the spectacle, but in the subtle shift of circumstance. The subtle glow intensified as he rounded a final bend, revealing not an exit to another perilous street, but a small enclosed courtyard surprisingly untouched by the worst of the destruction. A makeshift shelter, constructed from salvaged corrugated iron and tattered canvas, offered a semblance of refuge in one corner. Inside, he could discern the faint flicker of a small, carefully tended fire. Other figures, blurred by the dim light and his own weariness, moved quietly within the small haven. They were survivors like him, drawn together by the common thread of adversity, creating a tiny pocket of shared humanity amidst the overwhelming desolation. He hesitated at the threshold, the instinct to remain solitary, warring with a deep-seated longing for connection. Yet the memory of the woman's silent gesture, the subtle guidance, resonated within him. It was a testament to the quiet power of shared existence, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, threads of compassion and mutual aid could still be woven. He stepped into the courtyard, his presence immediately noticed, but not challenged. A man with kind eyes, his face lined with hardship, offered a silent nod and gestured towards a space near the fire. He sank down, the warmth a welcome balm against the pervasive chill that had settled deep in his bones. In the days and weeks that followed, this small community became his anchor. They shared meager rations, stories whispered in hushed tones, and the quiet comfort of simply existing together. He learned their names, their losses, their small, resilient hopes. He spoke little of his own past, but his presence, his quiet strength, became a part of their collective tapestry. He carried the indelible scars of his experience, etched not just on his body, but deep within his soul. The haunting images of loss, the raw terror of survival, would forever be a part of him. Yet alongside these wounds, a newfound resilience began to bloom. It was not a defiant, angry resilience, but a calm, deeply rooted strength, born from the crucible of absolute surrender. His demeanor shifted. The frantic, desperate fear that had once consumed him gave way to a quiet fortitude. He moved with purpose, his actions deliberate, his gaze steady. He helped where he could, offering his strength to rebuild a crumbling wall, sharing his meager portion with someone weaker, listening with empathy to another's tale of sorrow. He found solace not in forgetting, but in integrating his pain, allowing it to deepen his understanding of human suffering and, paradoxically, of human love. He never forgot the moment he lay broken amidst the ruins, his last breath a whispered prayer of surrender. He understood now that God's response wasn't always a miraculous intervention that erased all pain, but often a subtle orchestration of circumstances, a gentle nudge, a quiet presence in the storm. It was the unexpected kindness of a stranger, the timely protection of a hidden alley, the quiet gathering of fellow survivors. These were the unseen hands, guiding him not to an idealized past, but towards a changed future, one built on the foundations of enduring faith and rediscovered community. He knew the world outside their small refuge remained perilous, the conflict far from over. But as he looked at the faces around the fire, faces marked by hardship yet flickering with an enduring spark, he understood a profound truth. When everything fell apart, when all hope seemed lost, he had chosen to pray. And in that moment, in that act of utter vulnerability and surrender, he had discovered that he had never truly been alone. The silence had not been abandonment, but an invitation to listen more closely, to perceive the divine not in thunderous pronouncements, but in the gentle whispers of compassion and the subtle unfolding of grace. His journey was far from over, but he walked forward now, not towards rescue, but towards a future where his faith, tested and refined, would illuminate his path, a beacon of hope in a world still struggling to find its dawn.